Evans Family Garden. Today we are here in my living room. It is raining outside, so we're not going to be outside at all today. Baby is sleeping, so I'm going to try and be quiet, not wake him up. I do have the monitor here so I can make sure he's still sleeping and we're not disturbing him since he's right next door. So today, since it's raining so much and so cold outside, I figured we would just talk about planting the garden. I know a lot of you are still in winter and you're waiting and waiting to get into that garden, and so you're dreaming and planning and thinking about what you're going to plant, where you're going to plant it, that kind of stuff. So I want to go over my 3 main things that I think are important to take into consideration when you're planning out your garden. The first thing you want to know is, and most important, what plants are you planting? What kind of vegetables do you want to grow, and how many of each plant? So I do recommend, what I do is make a list. I write down what types of plants, not the varieties, but I want to grow tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, squash, melons, garlic, basil, all of those kinds of things. Write out that list, and then next to it, write out how many of each plant, or at least how many of each plant you want to grow or try and grow, so that you know how many you're trying to fit into your garden space. And then you want to know the requirements for those plants. So you need to know how much sun they're going to want, and how much heat that plant can handle. Some plants do better than others when it starts to get hot. Like cucumbers, peas, they don't like it when it starts to get really, really hot. So you want to plant them early on, and you want to plant them where they're not going to be exposed to sun the entire length of the day. Most garden plants do require full sun, but that just means 6 to 8 hours of sun. If they're going to get more sun than that, that's fine. But if you have a way to shade them during the hottest part of the day, or something, they'll be okay, but they're going to do better if they're not in like heat all day long. Like in Fresno here, we have summer days for weeks, probably like 3 months. Last summer was bad. It was 100 plus degrees every single day for like months. It was crazy. It was like worse than I remember it being here in a long time. And I've been here over 10 years. This is year 11 for me living here in Fresno. You want to know, not specific, but like which plants are going to do better with more or less sun / heat. You want to know how much space each plant is going to require, so how big that plant is going to get. So like my peas and my cucumbers, I know they're big plants, but they're going to vine up and take a vertical space, so I can plant something right next to them and it's not going to use up the spacing. The peas are just going to go up. They don't have to share that space. So I can do those vertical and then plant something next to it. But my tomatillo plants, for instance, are huge. They get ginormous, and so I want to make sure I give them enough space. Last year when I planted, 2 years ago when I planted tomatillos, I planted a pepper plant right next to it, and it got shaded out, and it got stunted, and it never grew, never gave any peppers or anything. So you want to be aware of that. Kind of just a rough estimate. A lot of knowing that is going to just come with experience from gardening. If it's your first year and you've never gardened or never had experience with sizes of plants, you can Google it. You can look a lot of the time on the back of the seed packet. It'll tell you how big your plant is going to get, so you can kind of go off of that. I do want to mention the back of the seed packets. Most of them, when they're talking about spacing wise, they are talking about large production spacing, so that way farmers can get tractors and implements through without damaging their plants. So you don't necessarily have to follow that spacing, otherwise you won't be able to fit the plants in your garden because you're trying to space them out too much. So they don't need that much space to be able to grow. That's to be able to harvest them with big equipment. Now if they say like 18-inch diameter, something like that, those are the ones you want to follow. I know MI Gardener puts that kind of spacing on the back of their seed packet because they know they're selling mostly to home gardeners like us. So you want to look more like that information, 18-inch diameter. So you need to know the spacing. You want to know how much water your plants are going to need, and what kind of, like, do they want like well draining soil for the water, or are they okay sitting in water? So like melons and cucumbers like a lot of water because their fruits are made up of mostly water, but things like garlic and peas don't want to be sitting in water. Garlic's going to rot. It's literally in the ground. It's not above the ground. So your garlic will rot if you're sitting in water. Peas like water, but they want well draining soil so that they can dry out if they need to. So you kind of want to know that, so that you're trying to plant things with like things, if that makes sense. And it's not like super important, but it is a small factor if you want to get that far into it. But don't stress about it. That's one thing I want to say is don't stress about it, especially if it's your first time gardening. It shouldn't be stressful. It should be fun. Plants want to grow, and so just plant it. If that's the only space you have left for that plant, just plant it anyway. Just plant it. It'll be fine. Okay, so that's one, is the types of plants you're growing, the quantity, and their requirements to grow. Second thing is the position of the sun and how much sun your gardening space is going to get. So wherever you're going to grow these plants in your garden, wherever your garden bed is, you want to know how much sunlight that gets during the day and the position of the sun and whatever's around your garden, if it's going to be shaded out. So my space is right in the middle of our yard, and so during the summer it gets full sun all day long. It's great. In the winter time, however, I do have a fence line and then a big building next door to us, and our sun is more of on the southern horizon during the winter, and so a third of my garden gets shaded out. So if I plant anything there, there's already shorter sunlight or shorter hours in the day, shorter sunlight hours in the day. I guess you would say that. And then it's also shaded. So any plants I plant in that area in the winter time don't grow very well. They grow like tremendously slower than anything else in the rest of the garden. So I've just kind of avoided planting in that space in winter, and I just heavily mulch it and just leave it alone because I'm not going to get anything from it. But in the summertime, it gets sun. Now I do have a fig tree right to the south of it, and then a big walnut tree, not south, to the west of my garden, a big fig tree, and then an even bigger walnut tree. So I do get some shade right at the end of the day on some of those plants, but not all of the garden gets that shade, and they still get hot sun in the hottest part of the day, 3-4 o'clock, right in the middle of the summer. So when I was planning out my garden, I wanted to take that factor in, especially for my tomatoes this year, because tomatoes, the plants, when they're growing, they'll grow the blossoms, and then the blossoms get pollinated, and that's what turns into your fruit or the tomatoes. But if it's too hot, the blossoms form and then they just drop off. They won't form any fruit. So if you give them shade, you are more guaranteed to have fruit later into the summer because it's not going to be as hot directly on those blossoms. So I was listening to Roots and Refuge Farm, one of my favorite YouTube channels, and Jess was mentioning that her friend Sunflower Steve, he had mentioned that you can use sunflowers to help shade out your tomato plants. And what? So, like, that's brilliant. So when I was planting, I'll put my big, let me put my plant up here. So you'll see my tomato plants are on trellises here, and then I have these yellow spots that are sunflowers. So those sunflowers are specifically in spots in my garden that I know once they grow tall, the sun, when it's in the hottest part of the day, the sunflower will cast a shadow on those tomato plants and help keep them shaded during the hottest part of the day. So I strategically placed them in those spots to help keep my tomato plants cool to hopefully get more produce throughout the summer. So that's important to know. That's why it's important to know where your sun is going to be during what parts of the day and what time of the year. For reference, for my garden, the top of the page is south and the bottom is north. Yeah, because I drew it entering into the garden on how I look at my garden every single day as I walk out the door to my house. So, back to my list. So, first was what plants are growing and how many in their requirements that they need to grow well. Second was the position of the sun and how much sun your garden space is going to get. And then third isn't like necessary to know, but it's just kind of nice to think about in the back of your head as you're plugging plants into your garden, is accessibility. So if you just have like a long rectangular raised bed, you're probably fine. But for me, my beds are 4 foot, 4 foot across. But it's this flat U or horseshoe shape. And so in the corners of my beds, like right in the middle of those corners, sometimes it's hard to access whatever is there, depending on where my trellises ended up and what other plants are around it. So whatever plant is in the middle of that spot is hard for me to like get to sometimes. So when I was planning my garden and I had some spots there, I wanted to make sure I put something in there that I wasn't gonna need to harvest every single day. I didn't want to have to try and maneuver into that spot every single day. So things like okra and peas and squash, stuff like that, I didn't want to have to reach in there. So I am putting basil, which I harvest every couple weeks. I do like a big trim on it and then let it grow for a few weeks before I have to go back in there. Or you could put flowers that you're not going to harvest at all. I could put my sunflower there, but that didn't make sense what I was doing with the sunflowers. You could put marigolds that are great for garden. You could put calendula, nasturtiums, something that you're not going to harvest, or some kind of herb or whatever you want. So it's just you don't have to do that. None of this you have to do. But that third bullet point is just kind of like something to keep in the back of your mind as you're plugging in your plants. Like, oh, do I really want to reach around to this other plant to access that plant every single day? No, probably not. So those are my 3 things that I keep in mind and I like to know before I draw out my garden. So let me talk to you about this garden plan. You can draw out your garden on a piece of paper, but my handwriting isn't the greatest all the time, and I wanted to be able to reference this when I'm out in my garden. I didn't want to have to take a piece of paper out when I'm planting my garden. I didn't want to lose my paper and get it wet, any of that kind of stuff. So I did this on my phone. This is actually done on an app on my phone, or it's a website. It's called Canva. It's a really great digital design tool. You can use it to make flyers, business cards. You can design a logo on it, banners, Instagram posts, stuff like that. It's wonderful. I've been using it for these other groups that I'm part of. I use it to make announcements, everything. So I thought it would be great to just use some basic shapes and kind of design my garden, and then I can move things. I don't have to erase anything. I can just move the circles to where they fit better and go from there. So I'll link it down below. I'll link the website, so you can go through the website on your computer. You can put the app on your phone, but that way I can just take my phone out because it's always in my pocket anyway, and oh yeah, I wanted to put this plant here when I'm out in the garden, then I don't have to get my paper dirty or anything. But you can use paper, you can use a notebook, there's these cool graph systems that people have online that you can download. You can calculate the first year. Sorry, there's a lot of truck. The first year I did this, I actually took graph paper and did like a sketch, not a one-to-one sketch, but a condensed sketch of my garden to get actual square footage using graph paper, and then calculated out after Googling how much square footage each plant was going to need and kind of drew it out that way. So I don't want to do that anymore. That's a great tool if you like numbers and you like calculating that kind of stuff out and you want to be more precise and try and get the most out of your harvest, especially if you're a new gardener. Those are great tools. I can see if I can find some of that kind of graph stuff and link it down below. But I don't do that anymore because it's more time consuming to me to try and calculate all of the plants, especially after growing for a few years. This is my 4th or 5th year growing now, I believe. And so I kind of have a good idea in my garden the amount of space each plant is going to require, so I can just kind of ballpark it. I know this is a rough draft for me. It's not going to be exact. Once I get out there and start planting plants, I'll probably squeeze in as many plants as I can, and we'll go from there. But so planning out your garden is great. It's a great way to, what's the phrase? Many of you are in winter still right now. It is probably snowing. I know it's snowing up in our foothills. It's going to be snowing out on the lake that my husband's going to for a fishing tournament this weekend. It is so cold and rainy outside right now, and so many people are not into garden season at all, but you're itching to get your hands into garden season. And so this is a great way to help satisfy that urge, I guess, to start seeds or to put a plant in the ground, because if you put a plant in the ground now, it probably won't make it. So just go and do some more dreaming about your garden. Try and plan it out. Have fun using a new tool if you've never used Canva before. Super fun. I use it for everything. Yeah, and so I hope this helped you kind of feel more comfortable about planning out a garden and give you some things to kind of think about when you're planning out your garden that you might not have realized. Oh yeah, I should probably consider where the sun's going to be, or how much space my plants are going to need. Like, these are things I had no idea that I needed to consider until I started researching my first year gardening. So if this helps you, great. If this was just a video for you to watch because there's nothing to do out in the garden, that's great too. Thanks for joining me. I like sharing my thoughts and my experiences. I do want to remind you that I am in Central Valley of California, and so what works for me here isn't necessarily going to work for you wherever you are. So do make sure you do your research for your area and the plants that you can grow in your area. So if you guys are in the middle of winter, or it's raining outside and you can't do anything, snowing, I hope that this video is a little bit of garden experience for you to kind of like sustain that itch, satisfy that itch. Maybe you can go and plan out a garden bed or plan out a dream garden that you hope to have in the future. I hope I gave you some key points to kind of think about when you're planning out your garden bed this summer that maybe you didn't think about in the past. Maybe you forgot that you should probably consider when you're figuring out your planting. And I'm glad that you guys joined me. I am so happy that you are here, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.